2. Dover. The Fisherman's Rest. In the kitchen, Sally was extremely busy. Saucepans and frying pans were standing in rows on the gigantic hearth. The huge stockpot stood in a corner, and the jack turned with slow deliberation and presented alternately to the glow every side of a noble sirloin of beef. The 2 little kitchen maids bustled around, eager to help, hot and panting, with cotton sleeves well tucked up above the dimpled elbows, and giggling over some private joke of their own whenever Miss Sally's back was turned for a moment. And old Jemima, stolid in temper and solid in bulk, kept up a long and subdued grumble while she stirred the stockpot methodically over the fire. "What ho, Sally?" came in cheerful if none too melodious accents from the coffee-room close by. "Lord bless my soul!" exclaimed Sally with a good-humoured laugh. "What be they all wanting now, I wonder?" "Beer, of course," grumbled Jemima. "You don't expect Jimmy Pitkin to have done with one tankard, do you?" "Mr. Harry, he looked uncommon thirsty, too," simpered Martha, one of the little kitchen maids, and her beady black eyes twinkled as they met those of her companion, whereupon both started on a round of short and suppressed giggles. Sally looked cross for a moment, and thoughtfully rubbed her hands against her shapely hips. Her palms were itching, evidently to come in contact with Martha's rosy cheeks. But inherent good humor prevailed, and with a pout and a shrug of the shoulders, she turned her attention to the fried potatoes. "What ho, Sally! Say, Sally!" And a chorus of pewter mugs, tapped with impatient hands against the oak tables of the coffee-room, accompanied the shouts for mine host's buxom daughter. "Sally!" shouted a more persistent voice. "Are you going to be all night with that there beer?" "I do think father might get the beer for them," muttered Sally, as Jemima, stolidly and without further comment, took a couple of foam-crowned jugs from the shelf and began filling a number of pewter tankards with some of that home-brewed ale for which the Fisherman's Rest had been famous since the days of King Charles. "He knows how busy we are in here." "Your father is too busy discussing politics with Mr. Empsey to worry himself about you and the kitchen," grumbled Jemima under her breath. Sally had gone to the small mirror which hung in a corner of the kitchen, and was hastily smoothing her hair and setting her frilled cap at its most becoming angle over her dark curls. Then she took up the tankards by the handles, 3 in each strong brown hand, and, laughing, grumbling, blushing, carried them through into the coffee-room. There was certainly no sign of that bustle and activity which kept 4 women busy and hot in the glowing kitchen beyond. The coffee-room of the Fisherman's Rest is a showplace now at the beginning of the 20th century. At the end of the 18th, in the year of grace 1792, it had not yet gained that notoriety and importance which 100 additional years and the craze of the age have since bestowed upon it. Yet it was an old place even then, for the oak rafters and beams were already black with age, as were the panelled seats with their tall backs, and the long polished tables between, on which numerable pewter tankards had left fantastic patterns of many-sized rings. In the leaded window, high up, a row of pots of scarlet geraniums and blue larkspur gave the bright note of color against the dull background of oak. That Mr. Jellyband, landlord of the Fisherman's Rest at Dover, was a prosperous man was, of course, clear to the most casual observer. The pewter on the fine old dressers, the brass above the gigantic hearth, shone like silver and gold. The red-tiled floor was as brilliant as the scarlet geranium on the window-sill. This meant that his servants were good and plentiful, and that the custom was constant, and of that order which necessitated the keeping up of the coffee-room to a high standard of elegance and order. As Sally came in, laughing through her frowns and displaying a row of dazzling white teeth, she was greeted with shouts and chorus of applause. "Why, here's Sally! What ho, Sally! Hurrah for pretty Sally!" "I thought you'd grown deaf in that kitchen of yours," murmured Jimmy Pitkin, as he passed the back of his hand across his very dry lips. All right," laughed Sally, as she deposited the freshly filled tankards upon the table. "Why, what an hurry, to be sure! And is your grandmother a-dying, and you wanting to see the poor soul afore she'm gone? I never seed such a mighty rushin'." A chorus of good-humoured laughter greeted this witticism, which gave the company there present food for many jokes for some considerable time. Sally now seemed in less of a hurry to get back to her pots and pans. A young man with fair curly hair and eager bright blue eyes was engaging most of her attention, and the whole of her time, whilst broad witticisms and Jimmy Pitkin's fictitious grandmother flew from mouth to mouth, mixed with heavy puffs of pungent tobacco smoke. Facing the hearth, his legs wide apart, a long clay pipe in his mouth, stood mine host himself, worthy Mr. Jellyband, landlord of the Fisherman's Rest. As his father had been before him, aye, and his grandfather, and great-grandfather too, for that matter. Portly in build, jovial in countenance, and somewhat bald of pate, Mr. Jellyband was indeed a typical rural John Bull of those days. The days when our prejudiced insularity was at its height, when to an Englishman, be he lord, yeoman, or peasant, the whole of the continent of Europe was a den of immorality, and the rest of the world an unexploited land of savages and cannibals. There he stood, mine worthy host, firm and well set upon his limbs, smoking his long churchwarden, and caring nothing for nobody at home, and despising everybody abroad. He wore the typical scarlet waistcoat with shiny brass buttons, the corduroy breeches, the grey worsted stockings, and small buckled shoes that characterized every self-respecting innkeeper in Great Britain these days. And while pretty, motherless Sally had need of 4 pairs of brown hands to do all the work that fell on her shapely shoulders, worthy Jellyband discussed the affairs of nations with his most privileged guests. The coffee-room, indeed, lighted by 2 well-polished lamps which hung from the raftered ceiling, looked cheerful and cozy in the extreme. Through the dense clouds of tobacco smoke that hung about in every corner, the faces of Mr. Jellyband's customers appeared red and pleasant to look at, and on good terms with themselves, their hosts, and all the world. From every side of the room loud guffaws accompanied pleasant, if not highly intellectual, conversation, while Sally's repeated giggles testified to the good use Mr. Harry Waite was making of the short time she seemed inclined to spare him. They were mostly fisher folk who patronized Mr. Jellyband's coffee-room, but fishermen are known to be very thirsty people. The salt which they breathe in when they were on the sea accounts for their parched throats when on shore, but the Fisherman's Rest was something more than a rendezvous for these humble folk. The London and Dover coach started from the hostel daily, and passengers who had come across the Channel and those who started for the grand tour all became acquainted with Mr. Jellyband, his French wines, and his home-brewed ales. It was towards the close of September 1792, and the weather, which had been brilliant and hot throughout the month, had suddenly broken up. For 2 days torrents of rain had deluged the south of England, doing its level best to ruin what chances the apples and pears and late plums had of becoming really fine, self-respecting fruit. Even now it was beating against the leaden windows and tumbling down the chimney, making the cheerful wood fire sizzle in the hearth. "Lud, did you ever see such a wet September, Mr. Jellyband?" asked Mr. Hempseed. He sat in one of the seats inside the hearth, did Mr. Hempseed, for he was an authority and an important personage, not only at the Fisherman's Rest, where Mr. Jellyband always made a special selection of him as a foil for political arguments, but throughout the neighborhood, where his learning, and notably his knowledge of the Scriptures, was held in the most profound awe and respect. With one hand buried in the capacious pockets of his corduroys underneath his elaborately worked, well-worn smock, and the other holding his long clay pipe, Mr. Hempseed sat there, looking dejectedly across the room at the rivulets of moisture which trickled down the window-panes. "No," replied Mr. Jellyband sententiously, "I dunno, Mr. Hempseed, as I ever did, and I've been in these parts nigh on 60 years. Aye, you wouldn't recollect the first 3 years of M60, Mr. Jellyband," quietly imposed Mr. Hempseed. "I don't know as I've ever seed an infant take much note of the weather. Leastways not in these parts, and I've lived here nigh on 75 years, Mr. Jellyband." The superiority of this wisdom was so incontestable that for the moment Mr. Jellyband was not ready with his usual flow of argument. "It do seem more like April than September, don't it?" continued Mr. Hempseed dolefully, as a shower of raindrops fell with a sizzle upon the fire. "Aye, that it do," assented his worthy host. "But then what can you 'spect, Mr. Hempseed, I says, with sich a government as we've got?" Mr. Hempseed shook his head with an infinity of wisdom, tempered by deeply rooted mistrust of the British climate and the British government. "I don't 'spect nothing, Mr. Jellyband," he said. "Poor folks like us is of no account up there in Lunnon.
I knows that, and it's not often I do complain. But when it comes to sich wet weather in September, and all me fruit a rotting and a dying like the gumption mother's first born, and doing no more good than they did, poor dears, save to a lot of Jews, pedlars and sich, with their oranges and sich like foreign ungodly fruits, which nobody'd buy if English apples and pears was nicely swelled, as the scriptures say. That's quite right, Mr. Hempseed, retorted Jellyband, and as I says, what can you expect? There's all them Frenchy devils over the channel yonder a-murdering their king and nobility, and Mr. Pitt and Mr. Fox and Mr. Burke a-fighting and a-wrangling between 'em, if we Englishmen should allow 'em to go on in their ungodly way. Let 'em murder, says Mr. Pitt, stop 'em, says Mr. Burke, and let 'em murder, says I, and be demmed to 'em, said Mr. Hempseed emphatically, for he had but little liking for his friend Jellyband's political arguments, wherein he always got out of his depth, and had but little chance for displaying those pearls of wisdom which had earned him so high a reputation in the neighbourhood, and so many free tankards of ale at the Fisherman's Rest. Let 'em murder, he repeated again, but don't let's have sich rain in September, for that is agin the law and the scriptures, which says,
Lord, Mr. Harry, how you made me jump! It was unfortunate for Sally and her flirtation that this remark of hers should have occurred at the precise moment when Mr. Hempseed was collecting his breath in order to deliver himself of one of those scriptural utterances which had made him famous, for it brought down upon her pretty head the full flood of her father's wrath.
Now then, Sally, my girl, now then, he said, trying to force a frown upon his good-humoured face. Stop that fooling with them young jackanapes and get on with the work.
The work's getting on all right, father. But Mr. Jellyband was peremptory. He had other views for his buxom daughter, his only child, who would in God's good time become the owner of the Fisherman's Rest, than to see her married to one of these young fellows who earned but a precarious livelihood with their net.
Did you hear me speak, my girl? He said in that quiet tone which no one inside the inn dared to disobey. Get on with my Lord Tony's supper, for if it ain't the best we can do, and he not satisfied, see what you'll get, that's all.
Reluctantly Sally obeyed.
Is you 'spectin' special guests in tonight, Mr. Jellyband?
Asked Jimmy Pitkin in a loyal attempt to divert his host's attention from the circumstances connected with Sally's exit from the room.
Aye, that I be,
replied Jellyband.
Friends of my Lord Tony hisself, dukes and duchesses from over the water yonder, whom the young lord and his friend Sir Andrew Fawkes and the other young nobleman have helped out of the clutches of them murdering devils.
But this was too much for Mr. Hempseed's querulous philosophy.
Lud, he said, what they do that for, I wonder. I don't hold not with interfering in other folks' ways, as the scriptures say. Maybe, Mr. Hempseed, interrupted Jellyband with biting sarcasm, as you're a personal friend of Mr. Pitt, and as you says along with Mr. Fox, let 'em murder, says you.
Pardon me, Mr. Jellyband, feebly protested Mr. Hempseed. I don't know as I ever did. But Mr. Jellyband had at last succeeded in getting up his favourite hobby horse, and had no intention of dismounting in a hurry.
Or maybe you've made friends with some of them French chaps who they do say have been coming over here a purpose to make us Englishmen agree with their murdering ways.
I don't know what you mean, Mr. Jellyband, suggested Mr. Hempseed.
All I know is, loudly asserted mine host, that there was my friend Peppercorn, who owns the Blue-Faced Bull, and as true and loyal an Englishman as you'd see in the land, and now look at him. He made friends with some of them frog-eaters, hobnobbed with 'em just as if they was Englishmen, and not just a lot of immoral, God-forsaken foreign spies. Well, and what happened? Peppercorn, he now ups and talks of revolutions and liberty and down with the aristocrats, just like Mr. Hempseed over here.
Pardon me, Mr. Jellyband, again interposed Mr. Hempseed feebly. I don't know as I ever did. Mr. Jellyband had appealed to the company in general, who were listening awestruck and open-mouthed at the recital of Mr. Peppercorn's defalcations. At one table 2 customers, gentlemen apparently by their clothes, had pushed aside their half-finished game of dominoes and had been listening for some time, and evidently with much amusement, at Mr. Jellyband's international opinions. One of them now, with a quiet, sarcastic smile still lurking around the corners of his mobile mouth, turned toward the center of the room where Mr. Jellyband was standing.
"You seem to think, mine honest friend," he said quietly, "that these Frenchmen, spies I think you called them, are mighty clever fellows to have made mincemeat, so to speak, of your friend Mr. Peppercorn's opinions. How did they accomplish that now, think you?"
"Lud, sir, I suppose they talked him over. Those Frenchies, I've heard it said, have got the gift for gab, and Mr. Hempseed here will tell you how it is that they just twist some people round their little fingers like."
"Indeed. And is that so, Mr. Hempseed?" inquired the stranger politely.
"Nay, sir," replied Mr. Hempseed, much irritated. "I don't know as I can give you the information you require."
"Faith, then," said the stranger, "let us hope, my worthy host, that these clever spies will not succeed in upsetting your extremely loyal opinions." But this was too much for Mr. Jellyband's pleasant equanimity. He burst into an uproarious fit of laughter, which was soon echoed by those who happened to be in his debt. He laughed in every key, did my worthy host, and laughed until his sides ached and his eyes streamed.
"At me! Hark at that! Did you hear him say that they'd be upsetting my opinions? Lud love you, sir, but you do say some queer things."
"Well, Mr. Jellyband," said Mr. Hempseed sententiously,
"you know what the scriptures say. Let him who stands take heed lest he fall." "But then hark ye, Mr. Hempseed," retorted Jellyband, still holding his sides with laughter. "The scriptures didn't know me. Why, I wouldn't so much as drink a glass of ale with one of them murdering Frenchmen, and nothing'd make me change my opinions. Why, I've heard it said that them frog-eaters can't even speak the king's English, so of course if any of them tried to speak their godforsaken lingo to me, why, I should spot 'em directly, see, and forewarned is forearmed, as the saying goes."
"Aye, my honest friend," asserted the stranger cheerfully, "I see you are much too sharp and a match for any 20 Frenchmen, and here's to your very good health, my worthy host, if you'll do me the honour of finishing this bottle of mine with me."
"I'm sure you're very polite, sir," said Mr. Jellyband, wiping his eyes, which were still streaming with the abundance of his laughter, "and I don't mind if I do."
The stranger poured out a couple of tankards full of wine, and having offered one to mine host, he took the other himself. "Loyal Englishmen as we all are," he said, whilst the same humorous smile played round the corners of his thin lips, "loyal as we are, we must admit that this at least is one good thing which comes to us from France."
"Aye, well, none of us deny that, sir," asserted mine host.
"And here's to the best landlord in England, our worthy host, Mr. Jellyband," said the stranger in a loud tone of voice. "Hi, hip, hurrah!" retorted the whole company present. Then there was a loud clapping of hands, and mugs and tankards made a rattling music upon the tables to the accompaniment of loud laughter at nothing in particular, and of Mr. Jellyband's muttered exclamations.
"Just fancy me being talked over by a godforsaken foreigner. What? Lud love you, sir, but you do say some queer things."
To which obvious fact the stranger heartily assented. It was certainly a preposterous suggestion that anyone could ever upset Mr. Jellyband's firmly rooted opinions, and then to the utter worthlessness of the inhabitants of the whole continent of Europe.